Linda here, and I wanted to share a technique with you today on how to stamp into embossing powder. So I'm going to start, I'm using the Globecraft and Piccolo Enchanted Aubergine embossing powder, and this has several mixtures of color and sizes of granules in there, so I can get all of the color and texture I need from the one jar, which is really nice. I'm going to use our Piccolo embossing powder adhesive. I love this. It comes in the dabber bottle, so I can easily apply it. It works great on a stamp as well, so I'll show you how we can do all of that. So let's get started. So I'm going to start by rolling my jar of embossing powder. We don't recommend shaking it, because if you shake it, the larger sizes and the fine grains of powders might separate. So if you roll it, you tend to get a nice mix of the color and sizes in there. So I prep that by rolling it and uncap it. Set that aside. I'm going to uncap my embossing powder adhesive, and I'm simply going to tap it. So I've got that totally covered with my ink, and the ink is going to hold the embossing powder on there long enough for me to use the heat gun on it to melt it. So I'm going to start by dumping out my embossing powder on that. We're going to melt the first layer totally smooth. Now I didn't want to tap this because you can see the larger granules on there, and if I tap it, they might fall off. So I just gently tip it over and let the excess fall off on its own. And then we're going to use the funnel in the paper to pour the excess right back into the jar. And we're going to cap that. You always want to cap your embossing powder before you turn on that heat gun. Trust me, I speak from experience. So now we're just going to simply use our heat gun to melt the embossing powder. For this technique, I prefer a heat gun that doesn't blow a lot of air, but any heat gun will work. If your heat gun blows air, just hold it up and start up higher so it doesn't blow all your embossing powder off. As you see your powder start to melt, then you can just move in and continue to melt. You can see how the powder is starting to melt here around the edge. I love this color. This is Enchanted Aubergine embossing powder, and it's got so many different colors, and it's got the purples and the blacks and the silvers. It's just really a beautiful color. So what I've done is I've totally melted this first coat. Now we're just going to let that sit and cool down for a second before I can add my second coat to it. So while that's cooling, I'm going to prep my jar again simply by rolling it and uncapping it. As soon as this is cool enough, I can put my dabber top on there and re-ink it, and we'll be good to go. One thing I like about the dabber top is if I wanted to do some detail embossing, this little top comes right off, just like that. And so then I can take a detail paintbrush like this, dip it in, and just paint smaller areas where I might want my embossing powder to go. Say I wanted to just emboss the center of some flowers and not the petals. If I put the dabber or an ink pad to that, then it's going to be hard to control where the ink will set. But by removing the cap and using a paintbrush, I can put this exactly where I want it. So now this should be cool. Yep, it's cool to the touch. So I'm going to go ahead and tap my embossing ink on here again. Remember, the embossing ink is what's going to hold your embossing powder onto your object long enough for you to melt it. So I bring back in my paper, sprinkle this again, and just gently roll it over and let the excess fall off without tapping. We're going to pour this back into the jar and cap it. For this technique, I like to build up 3 or 4 coats of embossing powders, and you really do need to use a powder that has ultra thick tendencies, and these powders from Globecraft and Piccolo do that. They have a mixture of fine and chunky particles in there, so you can get the texture and the color all from one jar. You can see it's bubbling up. I just love this when it starts to melt. Such a cool effect. So we're going to melt this coat totally smooth. Now as we build up coats, it's going to take longer in between for it to cool down. So you don't want to stick your fingers in this. It would be like sticking your fingers in a pile of hot glue. So when that's cooled to the touch, there you go, then we can go ahead, prep our jar. We're going to put at least 3 coats on here. So I've got my jar prepped of embossing powder. I'm going to go back in again with the embossing ink. You have to have the ink to hold the embossing powder on there. Bring in the office paper. Look at the colors and the granules in there. Really cool stuff. Okay. And you can see all the different sizes and colors when you pour out the powders. Just love these powders. So now we're going to also, again, melt this coat. What we're doing is building layers. We want to build a layer thick enough to stamp down into to leave the little ruts and crevices in here. So you can see the powder and the embossing ink is bubbling. It's just really cool to watch it melt. I think I'm going to add 4 coats on here. I really like it nice and thick, so when I stamp down into it, I get a good impression. But look at all the juicy goodness in there. All the color variations. Just beautiful. So we're ready for our final coat. So again, I want to roll my jar each time because I'm pouring that excess back in here and it's all settling on the top. So I'm going to roll my jar each time before I use it. Going to again apply my embossing powder ink. I love the dabber. It's just so easy to use. So again, we're going to sprinkle our final coat on here. And I don't have to worry about pouring out too much because I'm not really wasting anything. It's catching it on the office paper and I'm pouring it right back into the jar. So I have very little waste with this technique. So we're going to heat and melt this final coat. So this should be nice and thick. It'll give us a very good impression when we stamp into it. Look at that. I can see that this is extremely thick. This is going to give us a really good impression to stamp into. So I just want to make sure that it's totally melted. And it is. Now if I had my stamp ready, I could stamp right into it. But I always like to just take my time and work on this so I get a good impression the first time. So I'm going to be using just a script stamp. I can't make out any of the words. You could use a flourish stamp, something with some detail in it. So when it stamps in, it's going to leave you a nice impression. So what I'm going to do is you always want to prep your stamp with your embossing powder ink on there. So I'm just going to tap this into my stamp. This is my embossing powder adhesive or embossing powder ink, whichever you want to call it. So I'm now applying my Piccolo embossing powder adhesive. So this is acting like an ink. It's not an adhesive that you can glue paper to paper. It's an adhesive that will hold the ink into place. But we want to protect our stamp when we're stamping into some hot melted embossing powder like this. So you always want to make sure your stamp is nicely inked. So now what I'm going to do is I have my ink stamped, so I'm ready to go. So I have to heat my embossing powder back up. So you want it nice and flowy. And when it's hot and you have several layers like this, if you look closely, you can actually see the layers move around as it bubbles and heats back up. So it has to be hot for this. If you don't get an impression, a good impression the first time, it's no big deal. You just remove your stamp, make sure it still is inked up really well, and then reheat your little piece. It'll smooth back out, and then you're ready to try it all over again. You have to work quickly because the embossing powder will start to cool. So as soon as it's hot like this, I'm going to remove my gun and impress my stamp. So you're just going to press that down, let it sit there for a second to cool down. If you pulled it away too soon, it would be probably a big gooey mess. So you just want to let it sit for a few seconds to cool down, and then it will remove very nicely from your inked stamp. So let's see what we have here. And you can see how it's stuck there, but because my stamp is inked, it's going to lift out really, really nicely. Just like that. So look at that. Is that just not too cool? So this would make a great embellishment on a scrapbook page. You could add a little ribbon to that or some gems. You could punch holes and string a wire, make it a little banner or a little gift tag for a bag or a package. Very cool stuff. Well, I hope you enjoyed that technique and give it a try. Our thicker embossing powders are just great for this technique, and because of the colors in them, when you stamp into them, you can see we have a variety of color and texture in there because of the variety of color and texture that comes in this one jar. Thank you so much.